Our action in the Gulf is about fighting aggression and preserving the sovereignty of nations. It is about keeping our word, our solemn word of honor, and standing by old friends.
With those words, President George Bush led America into the Gulf War and now peace talks, the most direct U.S. involvement ever in the Middle East. I'm Ben Bradley of the Washington Post. President Bush spoke of keeping our word and standing by old friends. A line of principle had been drawn in the sand. But who are these old friends, and how did we become allied with them? What exactly was our solemn word? New information, much of it taken from top secret and now declassified documents, reveals for the first time the amazing and sometimes controversial history, a balancing act that successive presidents had to perform in the explosive Middle East. Thanks to presidential libraries and national archives, we are now able to determine how secret agreements and personal friendships ultimately shaped the national policy that culminated in Desert Storm. In this examination of America's secret history in the Middle East, we will disclose the commitment made by President Franklin D. Roosevelt to a Saudi king in a secret shipboard meeting, President Harry Truman's backing of Israel after emotional pleas from a former business partner, Truman's secret commitment of U.S. military support to the Saudis, President Kennedy's secret dispatch in 1963 of American forces to Saudi Arabia to guard against Egyptian aggression. Diplomatic maneuverings, commitment of armed American forces, it all has a familiar ring. History does indeed repeat itself. Take this top secret and now declassified cable.
One of the basic policies of the United States in Near East is unqualifiedly to support territorial integrity and political independence of Saudi Arabia. If Saudi Arabia should therefore be attacked by another power or be under threat of attack, the U.S., through medium of UN, would take energetic measures to ward off such aggression.
That sounds like George Bush in 1990, but that cable wasn't sent after the invasion of Kuwait. It was stamped top secret and dated December 12, 1947. That's almost 45 years ago. It was the first of many secret documents we found in presidential archives that committed the U.S. to defend Saudi Arabia. America's better-known involvement with Israel goes back to the 30s and efforts to create a Jewish homeland. The U.S. commitment was best described by President John F. Kennedy, speaking confidentially in 1962 to Israeli Foreign Minister Golda Meir. Kennedy's words have often been repeated in private by succeeding presidents.
The United States has a special relationship with Israel in the Middle East, really comparable only to that which it has with Britain over a wide range of world affairs.
A strong statement, rating Israel as second only to our historically closest ally. And there's more. Kennedy went on to say,
"We are in a position to make clear to the Arabs that we will maintain our friendship with Israel and our security guarantees."
In other words, there were formal, secret commitments that we in the press and the public didn't know about at the time. Presidential commitments to both the Saudis and Israelis, never approved by Congress, never explained at the time to the public. Our telling of the secret history will focus on actions taken by 4 American presidents from 1945 to 1963. Actions which set the pattern that continues to this day of maintaining close ties to the oil-supplying country of Saudi Arabia while remaining allied with the Arab sworn enemy, Israel.
Young, vigorous, the man of action, a new spirit in a harassed land, the beacon and hope for millions.
Friends, like a real landslide this time.
President Franklin D. Roosevelt laid the groundwork for our relationship with the Saudis. And it was Roosevelt who first grappled with the problems inherent in securing Palestine as a Jewish homeland. So it was Roosevelt who first had to deal with the conflict between Arabs and Jews over Palestine, a conflict where the differences are deep and emotional. For background, Israeli journalist Amos Elon.
The struggle is often presented as one between right and wrong, but it isn't. It's a struggle between right and right, the very essence, if you will, of high Greek tragedy. Palestine is the home of the local Arabs, but it's also the historic home of the Jews, from which they had been expelled, but which they never forgot throughout their wanderings and travails. In the 30s, during the rise of German Nazism, the Jews of Europe were by and large a people for whom the world was divided into places where they couldn't survive and places which they weren't allowed to escape to. I doubt whether Israel would have been founded if the Nazis hadn't exterminated 6 million Jews. I wish I could properly convey to you the full political and psychological meaning of this fact. Even Jews who chose after the war to live elsewhere concluded that there must be a Jewish state, a safe haven where they can organize their own defense.
The Arabs also have both a religious and political view of the Palestine controversy. Lebanese journalist Jamil Mroueh.
Islam is a word expressing man's surrender to Allah, the Semitic and original name of your God. In fact, the first Muslim was the Prophet Noah. Muslims believe Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad are all equally prophets of Islam. The Quran states in no uncertain terms that the Jews were Allah's chosen people who forfeited their favored status and the promised land because they doubted the prophets. That's an account to settle with God, not Arabs. The Arabs did not accept the Jewish logic in wanting a state in Palestine. The Arabs were being made to pay a price for crimes committed in Europe. Arab lands had been for centuries a safe haven for Jews. So Zionism was looked on as another form of colonialism, as the complicating factor that worked against the Arab quest for independence.
A third party to this tragic conflict has been the United States. FDR was the first American president to look for a solution. In the late 30s, Roosevelt also pondered the idea of relocating Arab Palestinians, possibly to Iraq, to make room for Jewish refugees. FDR had also put a committee to work trying to locate a homeland for the Jews in a place other than Palestine. At one point, he came to favor Paraguay. At another, the Cameroons, citing some very wonderful high land and wonderful grass. His task force came up with more than 600 possible locations. Of them, only Santo Domingo took in a few hundred Jews and offered to take 100,000 more. But Roosevelt also had the question of Middle East oil on his mind. In the 1930s, a California oil company was given the Saudi Arabian oil concession by the legendary Saudi king Abdul Aziz ibn Saud. By 1932, King Ibn Saud had created his country by uniting the warring tribes of the Arabian Peninsula, partly by military means, partly by persuasion, and partly by marrying the daughters of the tribal sheikhs. Ambassador Parker T. Hart was the first American consul in Dhahran, Saudi Arabia, in 1944. He recalls King Ibn Saud.
Very impressive figure, every inch a king, desert king, a man of great strength, great strength of personality, very persuasive, very fatherly. I can't describe it, but he made you feel like his son from the moment you sat down beside him. And King Abdulaziz welcomed Americans there for reasons which he loved to explain when he had the chance. He said, first of all, you're good oil men, because in Bahrain you found oil when the British there said there was none. The second thing is that you treat your Arab employees like brothers. The third place is you're a powerful country. You're strong, big, carrying on this enormous war. But he said, you are also very far away.
No president lives in a vacuum. He has pressures. He has people he talks to, each with a different agenda. He has friends he trusts, and what he does in any given situation often depends on who his friends are and who their friends are. Roosevelt had a personal friend, Jimmy Moffett. It was Moffat's company which got the Saudi oil concession and started exploration in 1933. But it wasn't until 1938 that the first big well was discovered. It took another year for the first oil tanker to be loaded. When World War II began, oil shipments were reduced, and King Ibn Saud and his fast-spending family were left virtually destitute. By the early 1940s, Jimmy Moffat's interest was in getting his friend the president to provide economic assistance to his other friend, the Saudi king. Roosevelt saw the great political potential of Saudi Arabia. The war made it clear that U.S. oil reserves would not satisfy America's post-war needs. So Saudi Arabia became a very important part of American foreign policy. FDR saw to it that King Ibn Saud got U.S. aid during the war, and in doing so formed a relationship that would benefit both their countries. The war also highlighted the tragedy of the Jews, and FDR tried to do something about that, using his new relationship with King Ibn Saud. In 1943, there was a plan put forward by some Zionist leaders that involved the Arabs giving up Palestine to the Jews in exchange for a $50 million payment. Roosevelt liked this idea and thought his new friend, the Saudi king, could help win support from other Arab countries. In July, FDR secretly sent an emissary to ask King Ibn Saud to meet with Jewish leaders to discuss the plan. The emissary was U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel Harold Hoskins, an intelligence officer who was an Arab specialist. Hoskins, who liked to wear Arab dress, had earlier developed a good relationship with the king. The king wasn't interested and strongly stated his position in this secret memo to Hoskins.
Aide memoir from King Ibn Saud to Colonel Hoskins. While we thank the president for his kind attention, our opinion in this case has not changed. All that we desire in the question is that the obvious rights of the Arabs, which are clear as the sun, may not be dimmed by historic fallacies or social and economic theories of the Zionists, which theories God has not ordained.
Hoskins, for his part, came back from his meeting with King Ibn Saud. In his own secret memo, he laid the Palestine problem before FDR in stark terms.
Not only you as president, but the American people as a whole should realize that if the American government decides to support the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine, they are committing the American people to the use of force in that area, since only by force can a Jewish state in Palestine be established or maintained.
Only by force. Almost 50 years ago, this obscure Army intelligence officer, who quietly served as FDR's back channel to the Middle East, sounded an ominous note, forecasting what has become one of the longest-lasting struggles of our time. Arab leaders, even those friendly to the U.S., were not about to agree to the use of Palestine for the establishment of a Jewish state. The dilemma was upon us. The die had been cast.
1943 was a year when Allied operations centered on Arab lands. It was the Casablanca Conference, the American sweep across North Africa, and Rommel's defeat. Yet through it all, Hoskins realized the centrality of Palestine to Arab politics. It is the single issue that has remained intact as a bone of contention between Arabs and their colonizers. It has become the acid test of Arabism itself.
Most Israelis at that time were sure there would be peace with the Arabs within months, if not weeks, after the establishment of their state. What optimists!
1945 saw the end of Hitler and Mussolini and stunning death and destruction from the war. But it was the discovery of the death camps of Nazi Germany that most shocked the world. By 1945, there was growing sentiment in the U.S. and around the world for the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine. Roosevelt was in ailing health and under stress from the war. Now he was the first president put into the pressure cooker of American Middle East policy. Roosevelt was a man who thought there wasn't anything he couldn't fix or anyone he couldn't charm. Finally, out of desperation and sheer arrogance, he decided to go see the King of Arabia himself, have a personal chat to discuss Palestine and oil. He would meet him in secret on an American cruiser in the Suez Canal. On his way home from the Big Three meeting in Yalta with Soviet leader Joseph Stalin and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, not even our closest ally, Churchill, would be informed the meeting would take place until the last day of the Yalta sessions. The differences between the aristocratic president and the desert king were rooted in history. Talk about Americans not understanding Arabs and vice versa. One example, the traditional exchange of gifts. Roosevelt, who knew the king was a horseman, decided to give him a bronze copy of Frederick Remington's Bronco Buster.
True Muslims do not allow graven images in their homes. I'm sure the Bronco Buster would have elicited a few snickers from the Saudis, but their tradition of hospitality would have overcome their religious concerns.
At the last minute, a State Department protocol officer caught this mistake. A more appropriate gift was chosen, a C-47 transport plane, practical for us too, since it would be accompanied by a 6-man U.S. military crew, and this would help negotiations to get a U.S. base in Dhahran. King Ibn Saud had his own gift ideas. For the president, a sword, robes, and musk oil. For Mrs. Roosevelt, what was listed as a harem costume.
Simply stated, a harem dress is a Hollywood-inspired fantasy. There isn't a harem dress or costume in Arabia. In fact, the king's gift was a traditional Arab dress worn by Arab women when receiving their guests. And the king's other gifts to the president are an Arabian expression of respect and esteem. If Arab gifts are misunderstood, it is no wonder Arab customs are ridiculed.
On February 12, 1945, King Ibn Saud and his party boarded the American destroyer Murphy for the trip to the Suez Canal meeting with FDR. As an old destroyer officer, I can tell you it must have been quite a trip. The Saudis wanted to bring along 100 fattened sheep, but Colonel William Eddy, at the time our minister to Saudi Arabia, got the sheep count down to 7, the first of which got slaughtered and skinned on the Murphy's fantail before the destroyer cleared Jeddah Harbor. The crew could not smoke out of deference to the king, who neither smoked nor drank.
The king and his party were observant Muslims, and similar to Jews, Muslims will eat only kosher food. So they brought their needs and more, enough to feed the ship's crew, to break bread with them. This is an Arab custom of hospitality, especially for a king. It was the king's first trip outside Saudi Arabia.
2 days later, in Great Bitter Lake of the Suez Canal, the Murphy tied up alongside the USS Quincy, the cruiser on which Roosevelt had traveled to Yalta and on which he would return to Washington. The two men, the king of the desert and the dying president, exhausted from Yalta, running only on his absolute faith in the power of his personality, talked on deck for an hour or so, then went below for lunch. It was arranged that they use separate elevators so that FDR could sneak a cigarette en route. FDR and the king quickly got down to business. The main topic was Palestine. Here, in a once secret document describing the exchange between the two leaders, we see the focus of their concern.
The president asked His Majesty for his advice regarding the problem of Jewish refugees driven from their homes in Europe. His Majesty replied that in his opinion the Jews should return to live in the lands from which they were driven. Make the enemy and the oppressor pay. That is how we Arabs wage war. Amends should be made by the criminal, not by the innocent bystander.
In other words, King Ibn Saud felt that the country that had oppressed Europe's Jews, namely Germany, should surrender land for their resettlement, that the innocent Arabs of Palestine should not be made to pay for the treachery of Hitler's regime. Israeli journalist Amos Alon.
Did anyone seriously expect that it was possible less than a year after the Holocaust to send the survivors back to the countries where their parents, their children, their brothers and sisters had just been thrown in the gas chambers? They needed a country of their own.
I can't see how Ibn Saud or any Arab at the time could have known about the immensity of the Holocaust. Even the US had closed its doors in the face of Jewish immigration. Further, the stricken Jews had not bothered to produce Arabic literature about the tragedy.
But Jews needed a home. It was a case of what was the lesser harm, sending them back to countries where they were being persecuted, or an independent enclave in a small part of Palestine.
King Ibn Saud expressed the deep Arab opposition to a Jewish state.
His Majesty stated that the Arabs and the Jews could never cooperate, that the Arabs would choose to die rather than yield their lands to the Jews.
According to the memo, FDR responded with what was to become his most controversial statement from the meeting. Again, from the secret files.
The president wished to assure His Majesty that he would do nothing to assist the Jews against the Arabs and would make no move hostile to the Arab people.
Roosevelt's secret statement of support for the Arab position shocked his aides. Nevertheless, he repeated his pledge in a letter to the Saudi king a week before his death. Parker Hart explains the Saudi reaction to FDR's statements.
The king and those who followed him regarded Franklin D. Roosevelt, the great leader of the Western world and the great leader of the United States, as having made a pledge which would carry on after his death.
There was a Saudi Arabian mystique in Washington in Roosevelt's days. It was still rampant long afterwards. Because Saud controlled the holy city of Mecca, he was considered a kind of Muslim pope, a leader of the entire Arab world. But if there ever was a key country in the Arab Middle East, it was Egypt, not Saudi Arabia. I remember President Sadat of Egypt telling me in 1979 that Saudi Arabia was hardly a nation state. Who has ever heard of a nation named after its king, he asked. Saudi Arabia, he said, was a trading company with billions of dollars in the bank, which it spends liberally as protection money to the current bully on the block.
American mystique apart, Ibn Saud derived his power by unifying the tribes of Arabia. This tribal base and Saudi influence extends well beyond the borders of Saudi Arabia. As for Sadat's comment, well, he was a brave man, but it really went to his head, and his words are just nonsense.
So, what really was the situation? Had FDR pledged the U.S. to hold off support for a Jewish state until the Arabs agreed? Roosevelt's real intentions can never be known. He died 2 months after his shipboard meeting with the king. What was left in the wake of this first major encounter between U.S. and Saudi leaders were the seeds of friendship, accompanied by doubts and misunderstandings, the beginnings of deep American involvement in the conflicting passions of the Middle East.
Truman of Missouri, a brave and honest man, a supporter of Roosevelt's policy for 11 years.
Harry Truman was thrust into the presidency at a critical point in American and world history. World War II was not over, but the post-war world was beginning to take its shape. FDR had been notorious in not sharing key information with his vice president. But when it came to the Middle East, Truman would continue to juggle American support to both Jews and Arabs. And as we will see, it was Truman who would solidify U.S. support for the new state of Israel and secretly establish military backing to the government of Saudi Arabia. Harry Truman was a man famous for not shrinking from hard decisions. One of his most difficult would be the question of the Jewish state. Almost from the day he became president in April 1945, he was pressured to do something about the Palestine question. Over the next 3 years, he would change his mind several times. But in the end, an emotional discussion between Truman and an old Kansas City friend would help shape the course of U.S. Gulf policy. It's a dramatic but little-known story. In 1945, Palestine was under control of the British, but London was losing command of the situation. Jewish refugees from Hitler were attempting to get into Palestine, and the British were enforcing strict immigration limits. Jewish terrorists were active, trying to force the British out. In Washington, diplomats and military officers around Truman strongly opposed the creation of the Jewish state. They feared irritating the Arabs, losing Saudi oil, and having to use American troops to keep the peace. On the other hand, Truman faced strong pressure for a Jewish state from the country, the Congress, and his own White House staff. Caught between conflicting Middle Eastern desires, the president lashed out at a member of Congress who, he felt, failed to recognize the dangers the U.S. could face from aiding a new Jewish state. Truman dictated this letter, which has often happened, he never sent.
November 24, 1945. Honorable Joseph H. Ball, United States Senate. Dear Joe, it is a very explosive situation we are facing, and naturally, I regret very much. But I don't think that you or any of the other senators would be inclined to send a half-dozen divisions to Palestine to maintain a Jewish state.
But like all presidents, Truman had a friend. This was Eddie Jacobson, who intervened to help establish the American policy. Jacobson was Jewish, one of Truman's oldest friends from Missouri, his partner in a haberdashery and fundraiser in his vice presidential race. In 1947, Jacobson wrote this letter to his close friend, the president.
Harry, my people need help, and I am appealing to you to help them. The future of 1.5 million Jews in Europe depends on what happens at the present meeting of the United Nations. Wishing you and your family the best of everything, I am, sincerely, your friend, Eddie Jacobson.
David Ginsburg served as counsel to the Israeli embassy in Washington for 20 years.
Jacobson came to know the man who became the first president of Israel, Chaim Weizmann. And it was Weizmann who made clear to Jacobson the kinds of problems that beset the residue, the few who were left in the camps in Europe, and the need of the Jewish people for a homeland in Palestine. And it was Jacobson who carried really Weizmann's words and often his ideas to the president, and I think made a substantial difference in the final outcome.
In Palestine, Jewish terrorist attacks had caused so many British casualties that martial law had been declared. In February '47, the British decided to end their control of Palestine and turned the matter over to the United Nations. A UN committee proposed a vote on the partition of Palestine, dividing that territory into separate Arab and Jewish states. After long soul-searching, Truman sided with his friend Jacobson and supported partition. He rejected warnings from Saudi Arabia's King Ibn Saud, who cited Roosevelt's shipboard pledge.
Saudi Arabia? No. Soviet Union? Yes. The United Kingdom? Abstain. The United States? Yes.
On November 29, 1947, the UN General Assembly, with the United States taking the lead, voted to support the partition of Palestine. Separate Jewish and Arab states were to be established effective 1 year later. Pro-Zionist groups around the world celebrated the news. But in Saudi Arabia, there was a very interesting, very telling development in the wake of the UN vote. King Ibn Saud had his own worries outside the Palestine issue. His rivals in the area, the Hashemite kings in Transjordan and Iraq, each appeared to have British support to challenge Saudi control of Islam's holy places. King Ibn Saud needed military muscle. In a private meeting with the American envoy in Riyadh, King Ibn Saud proposed a remarkable deal with the United States, a proposal which has had almost no publicity until now. The king said he would not let other Arab states draw him into a fight with the U.S. over Palestine, now that the UN had voted. And he had a reason.
His Majesty wished to know how and in what manner he might rely upon the United States' aid in resisting any incursion from Iraq or Transjordan. Whether the United States would supply the Saudi Arabian government and army with the necessary materials, since the threat was one not only involving Saudi Arabia, but also vital American interests.
Washington was so surprised by the king's arms request that it took a year for the U.S. to begin studying Saudi military needs. The UN vote on partition and the Saudi king's proposal did not end Truman's problems and Jacobson's quiet influence over the president's decisions. Fighting between Arabs and Jews increased. As some aides had predicted, outside force was considered necessary to establish the new Jewish state. Truman was adamant that no American soldiers be used.
There was a feeling that in the event that there would be substantial American casualties in defense of the Jewish state, there might very well be repercussions within the United States, anti-Semitic repercussions, and that neither the White House nor the Israelis wanted.
In the spring of '48, State and Defense Department officials recommended that the United States reverse its support of dividing Palestine. Instead, they urged the president to propose that Palestine become one country under UN supervision. Surprisingly, Truman agreed. The man famous in history for backing Israel reversed his support for a separate Jewish state. He approved the draft of a UN speech that in essence dismissed a Jewish Palestine as being unworkable. He refused to see Jewish leader Chaim Weizmann, and Eddie Jacobson got a middle-of-the-night phone call from the president of B'nai B'rith asking him quickly to intervene with Truman before the president left for his vacation. But he was too late.
Dear Eddie, your telegram reached me after I arrived in Florida. I was very sorry that I did not have a chance to see Dr. Weizmann, but my schedule was so very crowded that I simply couldn't get him in. The situation has been a headache to me for 2.5 years. The Jews are so emotional, and the Arabs are so difficult to talk with, that it is almost impossible to get anything done. Sincerely yours, Harry.
Not to be put off, Eddie Jacobson turned up at the White House a few days later. Truman's secretary allowed him in to see the president, imploring him not to discuss Palestine. These are Jacobson's notes.
For a few minutes, we discussed our families. I then brought up the Palestine subject. He immediately became tense in appearance, abrupt in speech, and very bitter in the words he was throwing my way. I suddenly found myself thinking that my dear friend was at that moment as close to being an anti-Semite as a man could possibly be.
But Jacobson was not to be denied. He pleaded emotionally with his friend to meet with Zionist leader Weizmann. As Jacobson recalled the scene,
all of a sudden, he swiveled himself around again, looked me straight in the eye, and then said the most endearing words I had ever heard from his lips. "You win, you bald-headed son of a bitch. I will see him."
5 days later, Truman saw Weizmann, and he reestablished his support of a separate Jewish state. On May 14, 1948, Israel proclaimed its independence.
David Ben-Gurion, Prime Minister of Israel, goes to preside over the proclamation of the new Jewish state. Everywhere, the flag of Israel is displayed.
Hours later, Truman recognized the new state and was followed days later by many in the world community, even the Soviet Union. Israel was now a fact. After 1,800 years, the Jews had control over what they had claimed as their homeland. Yet the joy of the Israeli and their supporters had to be weighed against the anxiety and anger of displaced Palestinians and their Arab backers. Now that Israel formally existed, the surrounding Arab countries declared war. The battles, both political and military, were only beginning. For all his vacillations, Harry Truman has always been portrayed as the American president who helped create the State of Israel.
Truman was not so pro-Israeli as is often thought. This business with Eddie Jacobson sounds melodramatic, but misses the point. In recognizing Israel, Truman was recognizing reality, that's all. The establishment of Israel was inevitable and would have happened without his intervention.
Truman's support of partition broke the Arabs' back. The Arab governments were a wobbly bunch engaged in a deafening dispute among themselves and facing the competing advances of the victors of the Second World War, who themselves were in rivalry. The Arabs chose the worst possible course. They induced political coma on themselves. Partition was not acknowledged, and recognition of the fact of Israel was tabooed.
But Harry Truman was far from finished with the Middle East. Now the region became a testing ground of the Cold War. America sought to continue its balancing act, juggling its Saudi and Israeli friends in the area, while combating Moscow's attempts to gain influence in the Arab world. King Ibn Saud, knowing he was key to American Cold War plans in the Gulf, wanted to cement his security arrangements with the U.S. He sought a formal military alliance with Washington. In April 1950, Truman sent Assistant Secretary of State George McGee to meet with King Ibn Saud. As disclosed in this secret summary of the King's discussion with McGee, the King pressed unsuccessfully for a formal treaty.
The king dwelt at length on his concern about possible aggression from the Hashemite kingdoms of Jordan and Iraq. He called attention not only to the United States' interests in Saudi Arabian oil development, but in the Dhahran air base, to show that Saudi Arabia's security should be a vital concern to both countries. The envoy replied that the United States was fully aware of the importance of maintaining the security of Saudi Arabia. The conclusion of a long-term Dhahran airfield agreement would include or follow a program of military aid and a military mission to train Saudi soldiers.
So, without a formal treaty, without public discussion or approval, the U.S. committed itself to the defense of the Saudi kingdom. The air base at Dhahran, which the U.S. had originally sought for Allied use in World War II, now took on a new importance.
The United States upgraded that facility at Dhahran, which it still commanded, into a very important strategic base. A ferrying base, if you will, but a part of the containment policy against the Soviet Union. So it was built for one purpose and then transformed into another purpose.
So Harry Truman, who very publicly gave his moral support to the creation of Israel, secretly made arrangements for the first American military support to Saudi Arabia. The strange path of U.S. policy in the Gulf had been set. America now supported two countries who openly opposed each other and followed often conflicting Mideast positions.
January 1953, the eyes of the world were on the White House in Washington, D.C., where Harry S. Truman greeted his successor, Dwight D. Eisenhower.
In the Eisenhower years of the 50s, the Cold War continued to escalate. It was a time of prosperity at home, but a time of increasing anxiety as America faced the communist threat. It was the age of nuclear spying, bomb shelters, and anti-communist hysteria. Dwight Eisenhower, the living symbol of American victory in Europe in the war, was elected as the right man to confront the Soviets and their allies. The communists soon found a way to break the West's hold on the strategic Middle East, thanks to Egyptian leader Gamal Abdel Nasser. Capitalizing on the Cold War and taking advantage of the Soviets' desire to expand their influence in the key region, Nasser turned to the communists to underwrite his armed border clashes with Israel. At the time, President Eisenhower and his aides saw Nasser as the leading threat to peace in the Middle East. Nasser is recalled by former American Ambassador Luke Battle.
He was very intelligent. He was not well educated by Western standards. He'd come through the military, and the military educational level in Egypt at that time was not of the highest order. And he really lacked a political economic philosophy. That was one of his real weaknesses. He was the founder of Arab socialism, whatever that was, and it really ended up being whatever he wanted it to be any given day. I think he used Israel for his own domestic political purposes. Every time he got in trouble, he would whip up a little excitement someplace in the world, and this is true of most dictators, and he was a dictator.
That sounds familiar, doesn't it? Nasser's appeal for communist arms began in 1955 and later was imitated by other Arab states sworn to destroy Israel. Naturally, to counter that advantage, new demands for U.S. weapons were made to Washington by Israel and Saudi Arabia. A proxy arms race began in the Middle East. That was apparent in these secret notes describing statements made by Secretary of State John Foster Dulles at a National Security Council meeting in October 1955.
The Israelis have made known to us that they desire armaments sufficient to match those which the Egyptians will receive from the Soviet bloc.
The Israelis had reason to worry about Nasser. Bolstered by Soviet support, he turned bold. In July 1956, he took over the Suez Canal, a move that led to an attack by Israel, Britain, and France. The United States stayed out of the conflict and finally forced a truce. Our Saudi allies were also concerned by the communist arming of Nasser. In January of 1957, King Saud, the son of King Ibn Saud, visited Washington. Eisenhower later wrote that his Saudi visitor told him confidentially that the Saudi people were demanding that he counter the military threats, particularly by Nasser. The king said that some Saudis were demanding that he deal with the Soviets to get the necessary arms for the national defense. But the king told Eisenhower that he wanted nothing to do with the Kremlin. On that note, Ike agreed to sell him more American arms.
King Saud was short on the will necessary for ruling, but he had an abundance of instinct, and in 1957, his instinct was right. The Soviet arms deal with Nasser had brought them to the mainstream of the Middle East. The British, on their part, were arming Saud's rivals, the Hashemites in Iraq and Jordan. So King Saud sought more American arms.
Well, the Arabs were being armed by both the US and the Soviet Union. If only a fraction of the effort that went into the arms race had gone into trying to make peace. The Israelis were naturally anxious to match the Arabs' arsenal. What a hopeless ambition.
Egypt continued to rattle the sabers. By 1958, a rearmed Nasser looked like he was going to take over the Middle East. Lebanon was in turmoil. Nasser's agents there were attempting to overthrow its pro-Western government. When Nasser supporters overthrew the Iraqi king's government, the Egyptian leader appeared unstoppable and a real threat to both Israel and Saudi Arabia. This time, Eisenhower acted by ordering U.S. Marines into Lebanon on July 15, 1958, for what became a 3-month stay.
I am well aware the landing of United States troops in Lebanon could have some serious consequences. Our dedication is to the principles of the United Nations Charter and to the preservation of the independence of every state.
In public, Ike said he was acting to save Lebanon. This was certainly true, but Ike and his top aides also had Israel and Saudi Arabia on their minds. These are the secret notes of the president's meeting with Secretary of State Dulles.
Secretary Dulles said Israel is held a hostage against us. The president agreed, noting that except for Israel, we could form a viable policy in the area. The question is how to take a sympathetic position regarding the Arabs without agreeing to the destruction of Israel.
Eisenhower had put the problem in a nutshell, and it is worth restating. How to help the Arabs without harming Israel. The juggling act, which began with FDR, had to go on.
John F. Kennedy settles into office as the 35th President of the United States, the youngest man and the first Roman Catholic ever elected to the office.
The presidency of John F. Kennedy saw no lessening in the Cold War. The Berlin crisis, the Cuban Missile Crisis, had threatened to bring the United States into open warfare with the Soviet Union. Seeking to counter the Soviets in the Mideast, Kennedy tried to move the U.S. closer to NASA and diffuse his anti-Americanism. When the Soviets sent advanced jet bombers to Egypt, Kennedy agreed to supply the Israelis with American Hawk anti-aircraft missiles. But in a new approach, Kennedy sent his ambassador in Cairo to inform NASA of the missile sale in advance. Somehow, this secret message was discovered and leaked by the Israelis. The leak angered NASA. Kennedy's ambassador in Cairo cabled that NASA believed that either the U.S. was double-dealing with him or the American government was so infiltrated by Israeli agents that private agreements were impossible. This new attempt at juggling Arab and Israeli interests blew up in the president's face. Predictably, U.S.-Egyptian relations got worse. Strengthened by Moscow, NASA's adventurism continued to worry Israel and the Saudis. In 1962, a revolution broke out in Yemen, a country on Saudi Arabia's southern border. NASA supported the rebels, while the Saudis aided the Yemen royalists. Then the Egyptian leader took a dangerous step. He tried to overthrow the Saudi regime. The U.S. responded. It was a new set of moves in the chess game of Gulf politics. Parker Hart, then our ambassador in Saudi Arabia, discloses publicly for the first time what happened.
In February of 1963, NASA sent over aircraft one day over the Hejaz coast on the Red Sea and dropped 109 bundles of ready-to-go ammunition, mortars, heavy machine guns with tripods, and all sorts of other equipment. Nasser clearly intended that these be picked up by insurgents in Saudi Arabia, presumably Saudi insurgents, and used to kill all of the royal family, which was due to assemble shortly in Jeddah for some special events that I can't even remember. In order to prevent this kind of activity from going any farther, Washington being rather alarmed over this, and President Kennedy in particular, very concerned always with every detail of what was happening in this struggle between Egypt and Saudi Arabia, sent out Operation Hard Surface, an American squadron, ostensibly as a training mission.
The F-100 fighter bombers took off from Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, the first actual deployment of American forces to defend Saudi Arabia, fulfilling secret American commitments. To this day, details of Operation Hard Surface are still considered as classified by the United States Air Force. These are the first films of that effort ever made available for public viewing.
NASA was informed that it was a training mission, and it was coming, and we assumed that he would know it was more than just a training mission. But we didn't say so in order not to force him to lose face. Hard Surface was deployed, flew irregular flights up and down the Hejaz coast, week after week, month after month, and was successful in general in preventing any deep intrusions of Egyptian Air Force after that time, and there certainly were no ground intrusions of Egyptian troops into Saudi Arabia.
The American public was never aware of that potential crisis, thanks to secret agreements and hidden diplomacy. So it's interesting to note that when American forces arrived on Saudi soil in 1990, it was not for the first time. From Franklin Roosevelt to JFK, the juggling act in the Middle East by American presidents continued, marked by secret arrangements and personal diplomacy. With the passing years and successive wars, we've become even more deeply involved in the Gulf. America has sought peace while supplying more and more arms. In 1967, Lyndon Johnson had to contend with the Six-Day War, a major and smashing Israeli victory. It was a victory for Western arms over Soviet-supplied military hardware. In the wake of that war, Johnson gave in to political pressure. In 1968, he sold Israel the newest American top-of-the-line F-4 fighter planes. And, of course, the Soviets countered by resupplying the Egyptians. In 1973, during the Nixon administration, NASA's successor in Egypt, Anwar Sadat, tried his hand at attacking Israel. He was defeated, thanks again in part to a rapid flow of U.S. munitions. In 1979, Jimmy Carter brought Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Begin together to sign the historic Camp David Accords. In return, he promised each country, you guessed it, more arms. But there were other events in our secret involvement with Saudi Arabia that set the stage for Desert Storm. That 1973 Israeli victory shook the Saudis. In response, the Saudi government asked the United States Army Corps of Engineers to assist them in one of the most far-reaching and innovative military construction projects in world history.
I was the last general officer in Saudi Arabia with the Corps of Engineers organization there. The Corps of Engineers has been active in Saudi Arabia since 1951 and constructed 7 major military cities there. The first 2, Tabuk in the northwest and Khamis Mashat in the southwest, were constructed to counter possible threats from Israel and from Yemen.
That's right. We helped the Saudis build defenses against Israel, the country we had armed. The Saudis were jarred again in 1979 when the Ayatollah Khomeini and his Islamic fundamentalist followers overthrew the government of the Shah of Iran. The seizing of power by the Iranian revolutionaries sent shockwaves through the royal Saudi government. More construction was added to what became a $20 billion Saudi program to protect that country from outside aggression. The last secret site, King Khalid City, cost more than $6 billion to construct and was designed to house 50,000 people. This was the infrastructure that enabled George Bush in the fall of 1990 to send in 400,000 troops without missing a beat. When Saddam Hussein moved toward Saudi Arabia after seizing Kuwait and threatened Israel with terror weapons, it was the first time that both our old friends had been under threat of attack at the same time. On August 6, 1990, in the Summer Palace in Jeddah, Saudi King Fahd met with U.S. Defense Secretary Dick Cheney on how to meet the threat from the Iraqi dictator.
I talked about the historic relationship between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia. Talked about President Roosevelt's meeting on the U.S. Quincy with Ibn Saud, 1945. I talked about the close relationship the King had with President Bush, going back to the time when the King had been the Minister of the Interior and the President had been Director of the CIA. common functions between the two governments. And then, of course, we talked about the threat, what Saddam Hussein had done to Kuwait, about the length of time it would take us to respond if they did decide they wanted assistance, that we had to make a decision rapidly if we were going to be there in time to be any good. Finally, I made the point that the President had asked me to make, that we would come with enough force to defend the kingdom. We would stay as long as we were needed, but once we were no longer needed, we would leave. That it was a temporary deployment. We were not looking for permanent bases in Saudi Arabia.
King Fahd agreed to the deployment of American forces to his country to be stationed at bases that U.S. Army engineers had helped build. With clever diplomacy, President Bush brought together other Arab countries to oppose Saddam Hussein's aggression, including Egypt and Syria. But the president still had to deal with Israel, the other old friend threatened by Iraq. This time, the balancing act required keeping Israel out of the fighting to hold the Arab coalition together. Again, it was delivery of American arms in the form of U.S. Patriot anti-missile missiles that did the job. With the war over, talk began about settling the Arab-Israeli problem, as if we hadn't tried that before. I don't suppose there's been a time since World War II when there hasn't been discussion about some agreement or initiative which would have solved what we call the Middle East problem. 1967 was much like 1991. Like Desert Storm, the Six-Day War was over quickly, and Nasser's Egyptian military, like Saddam Hussein's army, was almost totally crushed. David Ginsburg, then legal counsel to the Israeli embassy, recalls 1967.
There were many people within the State Department, the White House, and certainly within the Jewish community in this country who felt that now was the time to make peace, and to make a generous peace, certainly with Egypt and, if possible, with others.
But in 1967, the Arab and Israeli political leadership was not prepared to settle.
1967 was the great watershed. Peace was possible, I think, after the Six-Day War, but that opportunity was missed. The Arab countries met at Khartoum and said no negotiations, no recognition, and no peace. Golda Meir, the Israeli prime minister, was a hardliner. Abba Eban, her foreign minister, said about her there was one thing she absolutely couldn't stand: good news. Golda saw no reason to trade territory for peace. One reason was that the U.S. didn't press her to compromise.
I mean, in a sense, the 67 war ultimately generated the 73 war. It set the stage for the next conflict, in this case, of course, between the Arabs and the Israelis. I don't think that's happened this time. Maybe it's too soon to tell yet. We'll see.
So Israel's decisive victory in 1967 did not bring peace. It led instead to an Israeli request just before the 1968 presidential election year for the U.S. to supply its most advanced fighter bomber. Johnson finally agreed, and a new arms race began. 1992 is another presidential election year. Will history repeat itself? We have already promised the Saudis and 4 of their Gulf neighbors an $18 billion sale of arms, new F-16 fighters, M1 tanks, Patriot anti-missile missiles, and multiple rocket launchers. For Egypt's support in the Gulf coalition, the Bush administration wiped out $7.1 billion in debt and then turned around and offered to let Egypt incur another $1.6 billion debt in the purchase of 46 F-16s. Israel is to get a $10 billion loan and more weapons.
I'm never sure that all of the parties out there want a settlement. I think that oftentimes it's hard to tell whether or not there really is an interest if you go country by country. That to some extent the current state of affairs may be more attractive to many of the parties than a situation in which they would actually finally have to accept the responsibility for settlements, make difficult decisions, make concessions in order to gain concessions. And the test of whether or not you can actually produce peace in the Middle East, I think, turns very much on that question of whether or not the major players in the area actually want to resolve the issues.
It took the president, and particularly Secretary of State Jim Baker, 8 months of travel and negotiation to get the Arabs and Israelis to sit down together, finally, face to face, for the first time in 43 years. Madrid, last October, began the newest round of Middle East peace talks, but hopes for quick progress are not high.
And as I have said from the beginning of this effort, we cannot want peace more than you do. More than you, the parties most directly affected by the absence of peace.
Our action in the Gulf is about fighting aggression and preserving the sovereignty of nations. It is about keeping our word, our solemn word of honor, and standing by old friends.
For over 40 years, America has protected the sovereignty of Saudi Arabia and Israel and kept its solemn and secret word to both countries. The Gulf War escalated the world's attention on the Middle East and the need to establish a lasting peace. This time, however, the United States has assumed the role of prime negotiator among people who up to now have not wanted to make the changes that would permit a real settlement. President Bush can uphold American commitments to both the Saudis and Israelis, but he cannot force them to make peace. I'm Ben Bradley for The Washington Post.
The preceding program is a production of the Washington Post Company and WETA, which are solely responsible for its content. This program has been made possible in part by MC